This tutorial is an introduction to the SDA version 4 user interface and the creation of basic tables. It covers some enhancements made since the first release of SDA 4. We'll start at the SDA home page and then go to the archive page. And down a ways on the archive page, there's the general social surveys. Let's go to the GSS 1972 to 2016 using SDA 4.0. Click on that, and that will bring up the SDA user interface. Here we have a series of buttons that represent the main kinds of tasks you can do with the user interface. There's analysis, the default, create variables, and you can see that this panel is changing as we go to the different buttons. Download custom subset and search. And let's go back to analysis. And along here you can see that there are various tabs that represent different kinds of analysis. Again, as you click the different tabs, the content of the panel change. And let's go back to the default tables. Now the first thing we need to do before we do analysis is define some variables. There's a few ways to do that. One way is to look at the online codebook. Actually, for GSS, there's a couple of different codebooks. There's a standard codebook, the codebook by year of interview. The codebook by year of interview will break down the variables by the year, and that's often helpful in GSS because you need to know what years a particular question was asked. Let's look at the standard codebook. Here is the title page. There's a link to short introduction and weights. It has some information about the study and the weighting. And there's some indexes to help us find variables, a sequential variable list, an alphabetical variable list. We'll just look at the sequential variable list. And here we have a series of headings and subheadings. You can think of this as like the table of contents at the front of a book. So here's a main heading, respondent background variables. Here's a subheading, the first one, age, gender, race, and ethnicity. Say we click on this one. That brings us to a page where we see the variables underneath this secondary heading, age, sex, race, and so on. And say we click on the variable race. This will get us to a description of the race variable, the name, the variable label, the question text, categories, category labels, frequency distribution, percentages, a little bar chart here, some more basic information about that variable. And so let's close this up and get back to the user interface. There's another way to find variables. This section of the user interface called the variable tree. The structure of this variable tree is identical to the structure of the codebook that we just looked at. In other words, there's first level headings here, and in the tree, when we're on a first level heading, say societal concerns, we can click on this little arrow and drill down to the next level. Here are subheadings. First one is confidence in institutions. If we click on that, now we're down at the level of individual variables, and we can say look at ConEdu, confidence in education. And if we want to get a description of this variable, one way we can do it is to right-click using the mouse, right-click, and then we see this little view the variable window here. If we left-click on that, then a window comes up with a description of the variable in essentially the same format we saw in the codebook, but this time it's for confidence in education. Okay, we can look at that. When we're ready to dismiss the window, we can go down here and click this little X in the bottom right-hand corner. Or for these kinds of windows, we can actually just go anywhere outside of the window and left-click. and the window will disappear. Now we want to get this variable, say, over to the row variable input box. How do we do that? Well, one way is to drag and drop. So we go to the variable, we left click, keep the mouse button down, drag it over, get it over the input box, release the mouse button, and ConEduc is now in the row variable place. Notice we've the variable label is no longer here. When we dropped it, it disappeared. That's exactly what we want, because in these input boxes, we only want the variable name, not the label. Okay, so now we have ConEduc over here. There's another way to do essentially the same procedure using the variable selection panel over here. So let's look down again at the variable tree. Here's a variable called compress, confidence in press. If we left click on this variable, left click, that will move the variable name here to the selected box. Once we have a variable name here, we can click View, and that will bring up a description of the variable compress, confidence in press. Again, the same format that we've seen in the code book and for the tree and other circumstances. So we look at that. When we want to dismiss that window, we just click outside of it. Okay, and when a variable is here in the variable selection selected box, to put it over in one of the input boxes over here, we just use the copy to buttons. So we could copy it to row, column, control, filter spots. Let's copy it over to column. And now compress is in the column spot. So that's another way to deal with variables. Let's say, though, that we don't really want to use compress here. We actually just want to use erase, which we looked at in the code book. What's the easiest way to get erase here? Well, it's probably to simply erase this variable and type in erase. Sometimes typing is actually the easiest way to get something done. So now we have ConEduc by erase. Let's look at some options here. There's a weight. Often we use weight variables in doing analysis. Here's a drop-down where we can pick different kinds of weights that have been set up for GSS or no weight. Let's just stay with the default. Here's some output options. Notice too that all over in the user interface there are these little question marks. That brings up context-sensitive help. So if we're looking at summary statistics and we want more information about that, if we click on the little question mark, we get a help file here, and it goes right to summary statistics, and there's lots of information about what that option means. And as I said, this is a very large help file with lots of information. Let's get out of that for now. And let's look at chart options. There's a show percents chart option. That's often useful, so let's click on that. Decimal options, you can change the number of decimals. For the various statistics, let's leave those by the default. And now we can just run the table. So here's the output for the table that we asked for. Here's the table. We can look at who has a great deal of confidence in education. For whites, it's 28.3%. For blacks, almost 40%. Others, 37.3%. So we can see that blacks have a higher confidence in education than whites. The chart here shows us the same thing. Here's a great deal in the green, 28. Blacks rounds up to 40, other 37. Okay, so that's our first table, and let's close that up. Another way to look for variables is to use search. So let's click on search. Here's a box for search terms. Say we're interested in the happiness of various groups. And so let's type in happy and then click search. And here we can see we have a number of hits. In fact, we have 2 pages of hits. So we could go to the next page. Let's go back to the first page. And so by default, we are looking for exact matches to the word we typed in, happy. That could be the name of the variable, which is the case here. The happy could be in the variable label, which is the case here, or it could be in the question text, it could be in a category label. But anywhere that happiness occurs, we'll get a hit for it. Say, though, that we're concerned that we also want to find things like happier or happiness, and there we can use a wildcard, so we can go HAPP with an asterisk. That will find all the words that start with HAPP and anything following them. So let's click search now. And we can see instead of 16 hits, we now have 168 hits on a lot of different pages. We've gotten hits now for happiness. We have to be a little careful though, because we've also gotten hits now for happens, and anywhere that starts with HAPP. So we have to be a little careful about what we use as a search term and what wildcards we use. There's help here that gives us all the information about using search techniques, wildcards, etc. If you're doing searches, be sure to take a look at this. Okay, so let's go back and let's say that this variable, it's actually called happy and has the label general happiness. Looks interesting. We can click the view button, and again, here's that window with the variable description for happy. This is the basic question about happiness. How happy are you? So let's say that looks like the variable we want to use. We can dismiss this by clicking over here. And then the question is, how do we get this variable to the analysis form? Well, we can't drag and drop because this is where the analysis form would be. But what we can do is click select. And now that moves happy over to the selected box. Up here, we go back to the analysis task. And we're back to the tables form. And say we want to replace ConEduc with happy. Well, we actually know how to do that. We just click on row, and now it's moved happy over to row. And we still have the race variable that we had before, and all the various options are still set. So now we can just run this table, and now we have happiness by race. We can look and see who's very happy. Whites 34.7, blacks 24.0, others 29.6. We have a chart that shows us the same thing. Notice the color coding here. The cells that are in the red range have more in that cell than would be expected, and the ones in the blue range have less. There's lots of help about what this color coding means that you can look up, and let's dismiss that for now. There are a lot of other things that you can do with the user interface that are these topics are covered in other video tutorials. If you want to learn about other topics in detail, be sure to look at the other tutorials.